Welcome everybody. We're back in the Salted Orange podcast. My name's Luke,
Matthew.
and this is the second episode of our podcast looking at the church
In religion.
and religion. Yeah. So our upload schedule is going to try to be like every 2 weeks after the first episode.
Because we totally didn't talk about that last episode, which we should have. But we didn't have it made yet.
So, pretty much in our podcast so far, we've talked about our faith and how we grew up in faith. But we want to talk about more what it means to be like to worship God. Because what is God really?
Yeah. So today's conversation will be focusing around a conversation of really how we access God and what that's going to be like. So I guess I'll form a question for you. That's going to be a good start for that. And you guys can let us know your thoughts, obviously, in the comments of the YouTube video if you're watching this on YouTube. If not, you can go over to Twitter and connect with us there on that for more ways to talk to us and connect with us. You can tweet at us. That works too. So let's talk about God. If I'm gonna ask you to make a movie, and you're gonna make somebody be God, what does God look like for you?
I don't know. If it was to be funny, it'd be like Matthew McConaughey or something like that. Or what's the guy from Batman? He just retired.
Christian Bale?
No. The guy that that plays Alfred.
I don't know.
And he goes, Master Wayne.
Is that who God is?
Yeah, because I could just see him being like our helper or I wouldn't say butler because obviously,
Okay.
but I mean he helps us all the time. So I mean, but yeah, I would see him as like one of these big figures, or I mean, because I really see like more people in our culture see what Jesus looks like, not really what
Fair.
God looks like.
That's fair.
And so like I think about like, we have all these movies like they just had The Chosen, I think what it was called. That talked about, Jesus dying on the cross and stuff like that. And people have made jokes and stuff about like what Jesus really looked like and stuff like that. And like, because everybody says that you're at, when you're at Christmas, you have to have, the baby Jesus and stuff like that. And it has to look exactly the way it's supposed to look and stuff like that.
That reminds me of a scene from Talladega Nights where they're like, "Sweet baby Jesus," and they're praying over their meal. It's like, does it have to be? It's like, no, that's just not. I like baby Jesus, and like that's the way I approach it.
But I think like, what is God? Like, if you're gonna ask that question, I think you just have to look at like what, where you're coming in your faith. Like if you're entering like right from the start, or if you're, I mean, because that's a question that could be posed to like, I think someone that's like deeper in their faith, or even someone that's like starting off in their faith, and it would be two different things. Like I feel like as someone deeper in my faith, I feel like when people ask what is God, I'm asked like what has God, how have I seen God? And it doesn't have to be like someone getting healed or something like that, but I feel like when I see God is when you feel it. I mean, a lot of people don't think that, a lot of people think that faith is so blind. Because because I feel like the actual definition probably of faith is like blind. Like you have to be into something and stuff like that. But I think that God shows himself enough that we don't have to ask, how are you going to see him? Because he shows up. But I don't know what you would say, like God. I wouldn't say that God has to look like anything for anyone. I mean, it can be whatever it wants to be. I mean, a lot of people just think he's an entity and stuff like that. But I mean, I don't know what you would need to say it is. I mean, I think that you should do it based on your faith. Me personally, it's when I see God move through someone, or I see or I feel him when I'm singing or anything like that. I've definitely felt him in the middle of a song or anything like that.
We talked about that on the first episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, yeah, you've brought up some really good points, and we're part of what Luke was talking about with the experience of God is really what we're going to get into a little bit later in the podcast too. So I'm going to kind of pull us back to this question of what is God. I'll explain a little bit about where my thought process is, because I think there's many different ways that we experience God. You've named that already. And it really just depends on what you said, where you are in your faith. I think at the beginning of our faith, and specifically in the tradition we were both raised in, I'm going to throw back out the word traditioning that I used in the first episode, where we are kind of given this set of beliefs that we believe. And that's what you're supposed to believe, and that's how our parents and our teachers approach God and approach faith. And they're passing that to us as the way to do it. But there's many ways to reach God, and you can reach God through many different things, which we'll talk about in the experience section. But I think the primary example, and I've done a confirmation class around this, and I've had children approach me, and the number one thing that I hear back when I ask somebody what is God, I hear he is an old white man sitting in a cloud in a bright white robe. That is what I hear. So tell me about what you think about that description. I'm curious.
So like, there's also like a joke that's really, really funny is like, people say that like, if you think about Jesus, like he wasn't like the white man like
Sure.
everybody wants to say he was. And I mean, I think it really doesn't matter. I think people that like really want to distinguish that are really missing the point of like the story of Jesus and like the whole story of God's, works and stuff like that. I think where people see that is like in these old like cartoons that show like creation, they see like God come out and like he's like helping Adam and Eve, and you just see this big like man come out with like a white beard and white robe and stuff like that, and he just like snaps and something comes into picture and stuff like that. But I also think if that's what you think God is, that's fine.
Right.
Because we are not here to judge. God didn't put us here to judge. I think that's only God's decision. But I think that if you focus on like the actual, I think what you're coming to is like maybe like the way I look at it is I don't think of the appearance of God. I think of more like, what does he mean to you? But you could focus more. I mean, you could tell me what you think. I mean,
Yeah, I think you're on the point. You're reading into me really well. And I always critique that approach, like the white robed, long white beard God, because there's many things that are wrong with it. One, you have a limitation with racism, because you're limited by the race of God being Caucasian or predominantly white.
yeah.
And that's how it's portrayed in media, so it makes sense that people see it God that way. You also have a gender issue, because you're approaching God as masculine and only masculine.
Yeah.
And God doesn't have to be male or female, and honestly, God probably is not. But I mean, that's just how I would think about it. And I'll get into my approach, but I like playing with this perception a little bit, just because it's so accepted. It's how we were raised, right? Because you would say, this is what I would see God, like this is what people told me God was. Yeah. So I think a lot of us experience God that way, but I think about particularly some of the students I've had in classes talking about this were female, and how that when you define God as he and masculine, how that limits their access to God, because God does not look like me at that point. God is not share my anatomy, or I don't feel like I represent an image of God. And I think for me, that's why I have issues with this, because even though like I'm white, I could totally buy onto image of God. God is white, European, Caucasian, with just old, wise, clean white robes. Like we've put so many limiters on it with just that perception of God that like I can buy into it because mainline culture tells me that I am the way that the media would portray God, so I can access God easier than somebody who would be of a different gender or a different race. They might not have as easy access if it's a Caucasian version of God that we're displaying.
See, I come at that differently. Like I guess personally in my life, I guess I don't care.
Fair.
Like
That's
I really
fair.
don't care what he looks like. I really just think of God. I just thought of this. I really think of God more as like a light in the world. I think of his more like I don't give him an actual figure. I think of like all these movies where they'll have God talking to Jesus, and a lot of times when he talks to Jesus or any of the people like in the films where they have God talk to people, I think of him more as a light coming down, which I like that description a lot better because that I believe that there's a scripture in the Bible, but I can't remember what it says. It says something like God is the light of the world, but it says like getting rid of the darkness or something like that. But what it says is I looked up a description one time of what darkness is, and what it is it's the absence of light. And so like that's why I like to think of God as a light to the world. And I think if people get bogged down on like what God looks like, I mean, because the question "what is God" can be multiple different things. It could be what does God look like? What is God doing in doing in your life and stuff like that. But I think to get bogged down on like what he looks like or how he affects me can sometimes be counterintuitive, I think. But I mean that's my opinion.
Yeah, I'm pulling up because I think the passage you're kind of referencing was John, the Gospel of John, the first chapter, where it's talking about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and all things were made through God, and God has been made, and in God is all life, and that life was the light of all mankind. We're just talking about Jesus coming through the darkness, and it's specifically 1 John verse 5 where it says the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
Jesus talks so much about light ministry and when he's on the earth, saying that you are the light of the world, but you cannot hide your light as you are experiencing the light as God's love and how you share that with others and how you allow others to access God. And I would agree with your depiction that God would be, because we see it all this time in the scriptures, that God talks about God's self in the access of light, and how light kind of is a balance of good, whereas darkness kind of is shown as a moniker of evil. And so I would approach it in the same way, that it's that the way I approach God shows up in light and does not show up in a physical manifestation of any kind of embodiment of personhood like we would know it, because ultimately we do not know the ways of God.
Yeah.
We don't know what God even remotely looks like. Like we have no idea. We are just putting a personification on God, which isn't actually who God is.
And I think even the people back in like the Bible times, I don't think they actually saw like a man come up or a person come up and talk to them when they had God speak to them. I mean, because just think about the burning bush.
It's light.
There you go. Like that's God showing himself, not in a. I think it's so funny that God never shows himself. I always say he has his trump cards like in the back of his pocket, and he never shows his true self, just because I think he loves that mystery, and I think that's what helps us grow our faith too. Is there's so much mystery to our faith.
Yeah, I'm thinking of other passages too. Like I'm imagining the baptism scene of Jesus, and it's when the clouds part and separate it. it's not like this really physique looking man comes out of the clouds and it's like that's my kid. He goes, it shows a light. A light comes down and illuminates Jesus, and doves show that, and you hear the voice saying, "This is my son, who I'm pleased with. Listen to him." And God shows up in so many light imagery, and even if you go back further in the Old Testament, God's shown in forces of nature. Like you think about the escape from Egypt in Exodus.
Yeah.
God is a pillar of fire, which is a source of light, or a pillar of dust.
I just think that's so cool that he can show his power through other things without having to physically touch it. I mean, sometimes like he doesn't have to use man to show his power.
Right.
A lot of times he just uses his own power. I mean, if you look at other religions, they talk about like all the different gods. Like they'll talk about the god of thunder or the god of nature and stuff like that. But God uses all the powers at his disposal.
Right. Yeah, and we see that, like, the thing that comes up for me immediately is the contest with Baal and the altar that I think it's I want to say it's Elijah, but it might not be Elijah.
Mm-hmm.
Where he's like douse the altar in water and everything, and he has this servant of Baal, call upon him to ignite the pyre, and it just doesn't happen for the longest time. And Elijah's like, "Hey, God, just come and do this to show your power." And even though it's like soaked logs that if you've ever tried to light a fire, that doesn't work. It's really
I lit
miraculous.
one all summer. It was terrible.
It was terrible. Yeah, it doesn't.
I was blowing on that wood, and it was not happening.
Yeah, but it's cool for the understanding of, like, if you're gonna see a vision of God, for me it's always like an elemental force. It's not.
And me too.
It's not something that can be manifested in any kind of like.
But I've always thought if you kind of move back towards like looking at God as a human, then you're getting the wrong. I think you're looking in the wrong areas of Christianity. Like you're not getting the purpose. Because I think that's more of like a human thing that has been put on Christianity. I think that humans put that on. I don't think that God ever influenced us, because I don't think he's ever. I mean, because you talk about maybe like in like the Babylonian days when they built they were trying to find what God was, but then God tore all that down because he didn't care what if they saw what he looked like.
Yeah.
And he knew that they were, searching in false things that could not happen.
Yeah. I would think, I just remember so much media, and it depends on if you put your stake in this or not. But the closer we try to attain to understand what God is, the further it seems like we get away from it. Mm-hmm. And I think, for me, like, the reason we can't understand what God is exactly is because we can't physically comprehend it.
And I don't think we're supposed to.
No, we can't.
I mean, in our culture, and I was going to talk about this in the last episode. I think our generation especially, like the people who grew up in like the 2000s, when we were in school, we were taught to always ask questions, to always find the definitive answer. I mean, think about math. You would rework it just to find the definitive answer. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there is a definitive answer to God.
I think there can be. I don't think it's one that we will ever understand in our lifetime.
Yeah, exactly.
It will be something that if you're believing in the afterlife scenarios of heaven and hell, and you experience God in heaven, if you get to experience God in heaven as a physical entity, then maybe then you might know. But at that point, like, your human body will not be destroyed or broken apart because you can't withhold the information of just how great God it really is.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting that nowadays there's a new movie getting ready to come out. it's talking about the people that have died for like 10 seconds or whatever, died for, been legally called dead for like 5-10 seconds. And they have said that they went to heaven or went to whatever the afterlife is.
Right.
And, I think it's so interesting that people are still searching for what that is. I think that proves that God loves that mystery, loves that blind. I mean, because I feel like we have. I wouldn't say that being a Christian means you have to have blind faith.
Right.
But I do think that there is some times that you have to just believe. But to say that God needs to that it's important to know if God is a male or a female or whatever he is, or it doesn't, to me personally, it does not matter. I look more into the, him looking like an elemental figure, more like the light, because I feel like that can be more inspirational for people to think of God as light. I would say that to think of him as light is gonna help others think that are in darkness to see light.
Yeah, I see light because it's so, as I said earlier, it's so connected to the idea of good, and that God always wants our good. Therefore, as a being of goodness, you would embody characteristics of goodness, and if we see goodness as light, it would make sense that that is how God appears to us. But again, I'm agreeing with you. I don't think there's any way for us to know, and I don't think it's something that we probably need to know. It's not the important part of accessing our faith. We are asked to walk in faith, and that's part of the mystery, because we can't know these things. And if we know these things, who knows what that's going to do to us physically, or what's going to happen to our human body knowing that stuff. Because you think about like getting that access of information, and we've all probably said it. It's like once you keep hearing information, you keep getting things, it feels like your brain's going to explode. I would imagine your brain actually exploding if you got to know what God actually was.
Do you remember like the Indiana Jones movie, the fourth one? I think it was the fourth one. The one where like the woman at the end, she's saying, I want to know," and she's talking to the alien at the end, and she says, "I want to know," and "I want to know," and then her brain like explodes because she's like, it's too much for her.
Right.
And so that's what I think. I mean, I agree with you exactly. I feel like if we did know, it would be too much for us.
Right. Yeah.
I think wanting to know is wanting to be above God. You get what I'm saying? I mean, I don't necessarily know if I believe that, but right now I do feel like saying that would feel like you are wanting to be more than God.
Yeah. I also I'm thinking back to the story of like having physical injury because of trying to access what God actually is. And I think to the story of Paul, at this point in his journey, Saul, as he's walking the road to Damascus, and he hears a voice call to him, and we understand this voice is Jesus, but he looks up to see it, and he gets blinded because he actually sees Jesus. And I think of that story as kind of like an idea of what would happen if we actually obtained the access to what is God and what we could actually vision God as.
But I also do think that God had compassion enough,
right,
and he knew that that we want to feel that way. So that's why he did send Jesus, because he wanted us to have somebody we could, connect with. Because you see all throughout the Bible, well, not really throughout the Bible, but through the Gospels, you see Jesus having emotions. You see him having, he cried when his friend died. He cried when Lazarus died.
Yeah.
And he begged God for life when he was getting ready to die. I mean, he said, "God, I don't want to go through with this." I mean, and so like I feel like he gave him emotions, and he gave him all those things so that way it would ease our worries.
Yeah. I mean, I think about how we form relationships, and we always form with the people who we associate a likeness with. Like if I'm going into a room and I'm somebody who likes, let's say, music, because we've talked about that. Like I like music, and I see somebody sitting at a table at lunch who has a guitar. on their back, okay, that's somebody I could go sit with. But there's somebody else who's like carrying a sports bag, or there's somebody else who has a chessboard and is playing chess with somebody, or there's somebody who's engaged in on their phone. Like I'm gonna likely go to the person who, if I like music, I'll go to the person who has a guitar because I know there's something that we can immediately connect on.
See, I'm a little different. I feel like I naturally go towards the opposite of myself,
naturally
which
curious.
is weird. But I do see what you're saying, but I feel like that's why as Christians we do need to stay together because we're all naturally even though they do. I see all the time in media people show like what Christians look like, and it'll be like the awkward kid or something like that, and it's just like obviously like a joke, obviously, but.
Right.
I think it's so crazy how many different kinds of people follow our faith. I mean, and it doesn't mean that they have to be like so grounded in their faith that it's unreal, but I think it's so cool that we get to see the different different points in their faith.
Right.
That's what really that's what really shows that God is moving through everything and he controls everything, is that I see every time that God moves. And then sometimes we don't see, and I don't get to see everything because he does everything. So like if they're sometimes they're not physical, sometimes they're in someone's mind or anything like that. But I think that's if we were gonna go to how do we experience God, I feel like that's how I experience God for real. Like I see the things that move in his, I'm a very and our culture is like this too, but I'm learning to not be like that. I have to see it to believe it. And I think that's a huge problem. It's not a huge problem, obviously, but in my brain, I feel like it's a huge problem because I don't feel like God has to be something that we can see. And I don't know if that's blind faith, but I think it's okay for me to have blind faith.
Yeah. I think if you're looking into this more, specifically those of you who are more academic listening to our section of the podcast, Charles Taylor writes a lot about Secular 3, and access to that kind of literature, if you want to explore sort of what Luke was just talking about deeper, would be a good source. It is very, very dense and hard to read. So be prepared as you walk into it to spend a lot of time with it. And you were transitioning us into this concept of experience of God and how we're doing that. And you've explained it a little bit, so I'm going to share a little bit about how I would experience God. And I think for me, it's a variety of ways. We've already talked about the number one thing for me, which is it feels natural. It comes out of nature. I experience God the most intensely when I'm sitting around an element of nature. And that can be I'm sitting on a riverbank listening to the river run downstream.
I feel that way too.
And I can hear like it sounds like God just like whispering. It's like it's a sense of calm and God's presence over me. Or it's the wind. It's like, hey, go this way. It's like a nudge.
Has there ever been like a specific experience? Because I have one.
Talk about it. I want to hear this.
So I have a specific experience. This is when I was hunting. I like to hunt a lot, but so I had went out by myself, and this is the first time I'd ever went out by myself. And this was I was walking to wherever I was gonna hunt, which is really big deal. And so I walked down the road, and so where I was, you were going up the hill, and so this hill was tough. It was really scary. Like it was like very steep, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die going up this hill. And so I just decided, I started walking up a little bit, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is exhausting. And so I was like, I'm almost to the top. I'm just gonna run to the top. So I started busted out running. And when I got to the top, I passed out. That's how tired I got. So I passed out right there. I was like, I'm gonna die here. So I passed out right there. And so probably about 10, 15 minutes later, I wake up. And I'm just kind of sitting there. And I was like, man, this is the best spot in the world because I could feel God for real. Like I was like, man, this is the best spot ever. I ended up sitting there for 3 hours, just kind of like enjoying it. I mean, I
Right.
was hunting too, but I mean, I felt like I was feeling God. I know a lot of people that take their Bible into when they go hunting, and they'll just sit there and read their Bible out in the woods.
That's a nice practice. I can get behind that. Yeah, I would understand that too. And I'm gonna remind me to go back to that top of the mountain experience. But I want to jump back into one other element that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is going back to our conversation about light. Like I can be camping and I'll be sitting next to a fire and just hearing the crackles of the fire. It's like, oh, it's kind of like the heartbeat of God going. Like I can hear that in it. But the thing that you asked about an experience, and an experience that I've had is like anytime I'll be thinking about theology, thinking about God, thinking about religion, and I'll have a conversation with myself, like an internal dialogue.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, I'm trying to think through this, and I'll come to an understanding within myself, and all of a sudden, the sun comes out behind the clouds, and it reminds me of that moment that I talked about earlier with Jesus in the baptism, where the sun comes out behind the clouds, and that's just the presence of God enveloping you in light. So those experiences happen to me quite frequently, and it's when I'm thinking about these kinds of things and I see like the light suddenly get brighter in the room, not because it's brighter outside. I'm like, okay, so there's something I need to pay attention to here because God's working, and I need to understand that.
See, I get a lot of people that ask me a lot of times, they'll be like, I haven't had that experience yet. Like, have I missed it? Or is it something that, like, is my experience going to be different? And I always tell them, I say, your experience is going to be your experience. It's going to be different.
Exactly.
I don't think you should go. I mean, people say search out God, but God will show up when He wants to. I'm not saying that He's not always there,
Right.
but I'm saying He will show you Himself whenever He wants to.
Yeah. I think about it as like, it's all those people who are like, if this is wrong, God smite me now, and then you wait for lightning to come and zap you out of existence, but it doesn't happen. And I know those things could happen. Like God is all powerful and can do whatever God wants to do, but it's not necessarily always going to show up that way. It can be an experience where a voice pops into your, like I think Star Wars, and you're like in that scene where
You're thinking like Obi-Wan talking in the
yeah,
back.
you're in the X-wing just flying down the trench on the Death Star, and you hear use the Force, Luke.
Yeah.
Use the Force. And I think of those moments. So like that can happen. And what you said was absolutely correct in how I understand it. It's gonna be how you experience it. But it's not something you can search for it. But if you're searching for it to a deep point, you're gonna miss everything.
One thing that always cracked me up, I worked at a summer camp this summer, and one thing that we were supposed to ask the kids is we were supposed to ask them, where have you seen God today? And I almost laughed at that. I was like, why do you need to look for God? I was like, He should show up and you should be so excited to see it that we don't even have to ask you that question. Because if we're asking that question, they obviously be like, well, I saw Him when I was praying, in this place, or when I was playing with the water in the creek. And I was like, they're obviously just saying whatever the heck they want to say.
Right.
I was like, I want them to be so excited that they had that experience that it has changed their life. I had this one experience when I was a kid. I went to this summer camp that I'd went with a couple of my friends, and I had actually got them to go because my parents were like, oh yeah, you need to go to summer camp, it'll be fun. But it was the last day of the camp, and we were having like a worship service because every day we had like a little worship service and stuff like that. And we got done with the guy had spoke that was supposed to speak, and we were all just so tired. We were like, oh my gosh, I want to go home. And then out of nowhere, this guy just gets up, and he just starts. I don't know what had happened, but this guy just starts talking. And I mean, I would call it like preaching, but it wasn't. I mean, he was just honestly giving his like kind of self testimony and stuff like that. Like he was saying, this is serious. Like you have to do this. Like it is your life. And I had never experienced this, but I saw everyone in that, every kid, and this was kids. This was not adults. Every kid in there started crying and walked up to the front and wanted people to pray over them. We almost had like a small revival. It was crazy. It was the craziest experience I've ever had in my life.
Yeah. And it can show up like that. God can show up in those moments. But also God can show up in small things. Mm-hmm. And I think the question you asked, like, how did you see God this week? I don't think, and the way I would approach it is not a way of try to make up something, but really take time to reflect on your day.
Exactly.
And take time to think about, okay, what did God want me to know? What did I learn today? How did I grow spiritually and in my faith today? Mm-hmm. Because God showed up for something in my life that I wasn't expecting or I wasn't ready for.
Mm-hmm. I just don't think that this is me personally. I don't think that kids understand that sometimes.
Right.
And I think it's because we don't become vulnerable with them. I said one thing this summer is I felt like I was so vulnerable with like kids on my faith level. Like I told them that I struggled. And that's hard to say in front of a kid. And you got to approach it obviously in a certain way to where you're not just saying, "Oh, I messed up." No, you got to say, "This is important that I had a struggle because that means that I growed." And you have to show that you growed from it. And I think once a kid sees that, they can start to understand that. I mean, you can't make a kid love God. That's my personal opinion. You cannot make a kid love God. You cannot make a kid, experience God. But I think if you bring a kid to like some kind of event that you're bringing them to or anything like that, they can experience God. Mm-hmm. It may be a false experience. And what I mean by a false experience, I'm saying like they may just think that they have experienced God, and that's fine. But if you just let it be an experience, then that's what I would call a false experience. If you don't live from it, or if you don't learn from it, mm-hmm. then that experience didn't mean anything.
Yeah. And often when you have an experience, like when you encounter God in something like that's, not just the normal ways you would see God happen, like, there's wind, so obviously God created wind, or like, oh, this tree exists, God made this tree happen. He created the seed for it and planted it, and it was planted by someone to facilitate the growth of this tree. Mm-hmm. Like you can see it that way, but when you have an experience, mm-hmm. you want to do something about it.
I think one thing that, and this could be like a really big thing, but I think that what kind of turned people away from looking for that, or saying that an emotional experience is actually, seeing God, is when you look at all these like big movements that happened like the 2000s that mm-hmm. were like, where people were going to contemporary churches and going, wanting to go to worship, because a lot of these big bands that are like the contemporary bands started in the 2000s, early 90s or late 90s, and people thought it was just like they were getting emotionally drawn to it because of the music, because they were like, oh, this is the new great thing I can go to. And I wouldn't say that that's wrong, but I think that people are still latching on to that and saying that an emotional experience cannot show God.
I think it can. I think it does. One of the things I thought about, and I've been wanting to say, and I feel like I'm led to say it today, is the way I experience God with somebody else is such an emotional
me too
conversation. Exactly. We had this practice where we did like a little bit of like a small group kind of thing. You would understand it in the term of a band.
Yeah.
But it's just a small group session where we get together and we lift up our prayers for each other. And what was different about this one particular day is that I got up from the table that I sat at and I went to a different place. I found somebody who was by themselves. And they probably were like apprehensive to actually be a part of the. They're like, well, I'm not a strong prayer, and I don't want to. I don't feel like divulging myself to a group. But I knew this person, and I have a good relationship with this person, and I went up to them and I'm like, how can I pray for you today? What do you need from me? How can I help you get to God and feel better? And we had an emotional conversation, the most emotional conversation we've ever had, just by being guided by prayer and how we needed to pray for each other. Because it's like, I'm going through this hardship. At the time, I was like, I was looking for a job. I was terrified of not finding anything, not getting anywhere in my life. And I'm like, I really need prayer for direction. And they were able to open up with me and be like, well, I'm really going through this right now.
Yeah.
And obviously I'm not going to go through what they were. I feel fine saying what I went through, but I'm not going to divulge what they went through in case they're out there listening. But I was able to connect with them on a deeper level because they needed somebody who was going to show up for them and come into that space with their own vulnerability. And
Exactly.
because I was able to share deeply what was affecting me, what was the most important thing that I had an issue with at the moment, they felt that they could open up to me. And I was told after that was over, it's like, I didn't realize I needed this today. But this has really made I got nothing out of the service. Like, I could get nothing else out of the service that was happening or anything else that we were doing that day, but that's what I needed to come for.
And that's what I think, like, if we go back to really what we're starting this podcast for, is to really, like, talk about, like, why churches are declining. And I think, me personally, I think we're losing our personality, like, we're losing our personal inclusion in church. I mean, we're not making it about us. I mean, a lot of people say nowadays that the church is selfish and all that stuff, and you're being selfish. I mean, they're talking about a different kind of selfish. They're talking about you're selfish by, like, you're not letting people come into your church and stuff like that. But when I talk about that, I'm talking about that we're not selfish when it comes to, like, we need God just as much as other people do.
Right.
I don't think that. I mean, we talked about last episode, like, punching your ticket in. I think if you punch your ticket, then you have closed yourself off from God. And because God's still ready to work within you. That's what I think. A lot of times I get emotional when I talk about that in, like, a sermon and stuff like that. I'll say, God still wants to work with you. Right. Even when you're 60, 70, 80 years old, you still have a purpose. If you didn't, you die. God would make us die when we're 20 or 30, whatever. Right. Like, you still have a purpose. I always think back to my pawpaw. He helped me guide my faith. And, like, I talked about in a sermon, I made this sermon titled Legacy. And I talked about how he put such an imprint on my life that helped lead my faith. I mean, just think about how someone has affected your life to where, like, even my parents have affected my life in faith. And it's not just because they made me go to church and stuff like that. They have struggled with their faith. Yeah. But I think that if we talk about how we experience God, it has to, in there somewhere, it has to talk about how we have struggled with our faith too.
Yeah.
Because that is an experience.
Yeah, I just did a study, just finished it up. Actually, I'm either just finished it up or I just started it. That's not important. What's important is that we are finding ourselves in the struggle and in those periods of anxiousness. And it's funny because I remember it was a new perspective for me that when we feel anxious about something or we worry about something like that, that is our that becomes our prayer. That it is a way that we are praying for the worst thing to happen.
Yeah,
instead of having this gratitude in this moment that I'm allowed to experience this hardship and come out of it a better person and a stronger person in my faith, because God knows that's how I'm going to be forged. That's how I'm going to become a better Christian, is because I can have this experience and grow from it.
I always think back to like when people always make this joke that like the people who are leaders in faith have always had to go through like a big hardship,
Right.
like they'll always say that
Right.
like I've read about these like Christian singers that like they've come back from drugs and like God led them back and stuff like that. And I'm always like, oh yeah, great, that's great. But like that always when I was younger, I was always be like, well, I won't have a testimony because I haven't went any. I didn't go through drugs. I didn't go through that. How am I supposed to be like a leader in faith? And I've learned that like the small struggles are what people want to learn from. Mm-hmm. It's not. I mean, people love hearing a story, like of somebody coming back from drugs or something like that. But I feel like to make it more personable, you'll talk about something small that they've led back from. Mm-hmm. Which I don't know what that could be for anyone, but for me, it's just talking about not having such high expectations on myself. I know probably both of us have ever had that before. A lot of times that leads people away from faith. A lot of times. I have friends that have had high expectations in faith, and they have wanted to abandon them because they're scared of it. Because like let's say you're a pastor's kid. I mean, this is a huge thing because everybody says a pastor's kid is the most wild.
They're not wrong because I am one.
But let's say that you're expected to be a pastor, and let's say you don't do it. Well, you're in your mind that people might not necessarily judge you, but you are going to internally judge yourself, and it may affect your faith like crazy. Like I think it probably has for me. My dad works in the church, and what's bad about that is I see things that I don't want to see in church, and it challenges my faith a lot. You'll see. I mean, a lot of people think you go to church on Sunday, and you do other stuff, but if you see the behind the scenes after Sunday, sometimes it'll scare you.
Yeah.
And because you gotta have, that's where you gotta grow your faith, and you gotta know what is God and how you have experienced God, because if you can't, you will crumble. I talk about this all the time in my Bible study. I talk about that we have to have spiritual armor to start experiencing the world. Because if we don't have it, we'll crumble so fast. And people that aren't Christians are going to judge people who are Christians a lot more than Christians are going to judge Christians. Just because, I mean, there's an age-old saying that they say, you are the first Bible anyone will ever see. And because, I mean, me personally, I mean, my mom hates when I say this, like, people aren't going to just read the Bible to read the Bible.
No.
It just doesn't happen. And so I think when people look at you, and that can be such a huge burden. And I think we need to start telling people that, being a Christian is not the perfect life. You don't live the perfect life. I mean, God talks all the time, and Jesus talked about it too. You come as a sinner to be saved. And so, I think if we can get past this, like, big stereotype that Christians have to be perfect. And I think that can change, that needs to change first inside the church itself. It doesn't have to be in society. But I mean, I don't know how you feel about that. Do you feel?
I would say you're right on that. You're hitting the nail on the head, and probably putting it through the piece of wood and into the next thing that's holding the wood up. Because we have such a harsh society that judges people they judge people on appearance and on what they're doing and how they're using their life and what that entails for them. And you're never going to be perfect. And I'm going to say this all through the rest of my life, like, you're never going to be perfect. We can strive for perfection, and John Wesley says that we should be aiming for perfection with the help of God.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't, it's not something that you're really going to attain, but you strive after, because if you're going to be perfect, you become like Jesus.
Yeah,
Jesus
exactly.
was perfect. And that's, as Christians, we are aiming to be as Jesus-like as we can be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we had the bracelets back in the 2000s. It was like WWJD, what would Jesus do? And everybody wore those. It's like,
I don't think I ever had one of those.
yeah,
That's cool.
But yeah, that's a reminder.
I was thinking of silly bands.
That works too. Yeah, the silly bands that had it too. Yeah, those were the periods, and you just, okay, what would Jesus do in this situation? And it was a fun way to be like, okay, well, remember your religious training and your faith orientation, but it seemed kind of silly to have those. I mean, they were literally silly bands. It seemed silly to wear them, but when we approach faith like that, it's like, what would Jesus do? How do we become more perfect?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the experience we're having.
Yeah, I see. My experience is a little different. I never thought, what would Jesus do? And this is really interesting. I always thought, what would my grandma think if I was doing this?
Oh, that's a good one.
And it was just because my grandma is such a spiritual woman. Such a spiritual woman. My grandpa was too, but I always think my grandma every time. I mean, I told my mom this the other day. I said, anytime I do something bad or something that could be considered bad, I'm always like, I would always think in my head, especially this in elementary school or middle school, or I would say this all the time. I'd be like, what would grandma think if I just did that? And it's so funny that, like, that, that's what I was really talking about with my sermon with Legacy, is I was like, is someone keeping an accountability on you?
Right, yeah, that's a good word.
And, I mean, John Wesley talks about that's why we need small groups, is to keep accountability. And I'm not saying that we need to be accountable by, like, we need to, like, shun this person because they did that, but we need to, like, be checking on that person. Mm-hmm. And I think just if we do that, we will learn to experience God through those people.
Yeah. So I wanted to jump back to the top of the mountain experience.
Okay.
Because and I think this might be a good way for us to wrap up today. But I understand your thought on your story when you talk about getting to that top of the mountain. You were just there for 3 hours because you're just enveloped in the creation of God at that point. It's like, I remember, and it's one of the reasons I love hiking so much.
Yeah.
It's when you get to the end, you've done an arduous task of traveling up that mountain. It can be a hill, but you traveled up this body of land that is difficult and not flat and causes you to actually work for it. It's a journey. It's an adventure. Mm-hmm. But you get to the top, and the view just takes your breath away, because you can look out over the mass of trees and even city skylines and just over the creation of God, and you see just the world from a different perspective. Not maybe it's because of low oxygen, because you've been trying to get up this mountain, but
yeah,
it's such a different feeling of existing, because you have the experience of seeing a wider landscape of creation rather than just your limited view of when you look out the window or something like that.
I want to give this to, like, any of our listeners. This is a question I have. Can you, and this is something we don't even have to talk about today, but can you be on that mountain too long? Can you be on the top too long?
That's a good question.
I mean, I think there's a lot of pastors that are dealing with this problem right now, is that people are up on top of that mountain too long. They don't want to go back down in the valley. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying, what I would think of faith as is like, so you start your journey and you're climbing your mountain. Well, now you need to go back down. And I'm not saying you need to, lessen your faith. You need to go back down and grab others and take them back up on the mountain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about, so I'm going to go back to the story of David and Goliath. Mm-hmm. And if you've ever seen a visual representation of this, there is two hills, and one army is the Philistines and one army is the Israelites. And in the middle is the valley, and that's where they're fighting in the valley.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're camped up on these high grounds for perception. And I said high ground, so I'm thinking of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Star Wars again. But you're in this perspective that you can see over everything. And you're looking over everything, you can see everything, you can imagine, and you're like, okay, you know, that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not where the work's being done.
Yeah.
The work is done down in the trenches, and you have to get. So yes, you can be in the clouds too long. That's why it's called getting your head in the clouds. You're above everything else, and you're not actually participating in the active part of doing.
I think that's like
the ministry.
the biggest problem in our church right now. Like, I think people are like, I think a lot of people get stuck in the clouds.
Yeah, we're like, this looks terrible. I'm not gonna come help it. I don't want to go down there.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm just gonna sit up here where I'm good.
But I think to kind of like round our point, I think like knowing how you experience God is like the most important thing, is one of the most important things in your faith. Because I mean, to be a Christian, you have to know what God is. By what God is, I'm saying how you have experienced God. I'm not saying you need to know what God is. I'm saying you need to know how you experience God.
Yeah, because the number one way you're going to be tested, I think about, because I did a little bit of studying in marketing, and it's like it's always talking about that elevator pitch. It's like you're always going to have those people who want to condemn you and come after you, and they're going to persecute you by asking you, what is God? How do you experience God? And if you don't have a 30-second elevator pitch to give to somebody that can change their life, you lost them.
I think one of our topics for a later episode is going to be like, why church? Why do we? Why do we? And it's not going to be like why. I think what it's going to be like is we need to be able to say in our personal experiences how we could say church is important.
Right. Yeah. Good way to articulate how we use our experience of God within the context of our church communities to access our faith and allow us to pursue spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a fun hour. We may have got off the rails a little bit, but if you were looking at our structure for the podcast, it's really, really small. We were just going to go with whatever we were wanting to do.
I mean, I said there were going to be big topics and they were going to take an hour, and here we are.
Yeah. But remember, you can always, ask questions on our YouTube comments, or you can, hit us up on Twitter. I'm not a huge Twitter person, but I'm learning it.
No. I got you. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. But we really want to know, because honestly, my goal with this podcast is to make it all around our viewers. I mean, I want to not answer their questions, because we don't have the answers. We just have what we think. Right. And so I want you to be able to go out in the world and share your faith. That's my biggest thing. So please leave a comment on there, because that's going to really help. And I honestly want to read them. And we want to, probably one of our future things we've talked about maybe doing on a podcast is having some guests on our podcast. I talked about having my dad on a podcast.
Right.
Maybe having his dad on a podcast, mom, whatever you want. But what we really want to do is have maybe some people who have questions about their faith.
Yeah, we'd love to explore them with you, because, when we talk about it, we evoke new awareness of how we might live into pursuing our faith. And something we say here or something you bring up to us might lead to a really rich and deep conversation that will change the way somebody else perceives and accesses God.
And you might be in Matthew's sermon.
You will be in my sermon.
But, thanks for you guys for listening. And just, remember to follow us on all those platforms. And we'll see you later.